Welcome back to part 6, how I built my pole barn shop. After the garage door was installed, I next turned my attention to building an attic access door. Here is a view of the opening during earlier construction. The access is located directly above the bathroom in the southwest corner of the shop. Because the rest of the shop is so well insulated, I obviously wanted to make sure that the attic door was also insulated as much as possible. Here you can see the door under construction. My design was very simple. A 3/4 inch piece of plywood formed the base and provided the skeleton strength of the door. The small 2x4 piece you see was where the door handle would later be placed. The outside metal edge was simply 24 gauge aluminum bent into a C pattern and screwed to the wood. As seen here, 2 layers of 1.5 inch insulation boards were then slid into place. I then slid in a piece of scrap linoleum on top to give it a finished look. Pop rivets were then used to tie the metal together. In this photo you can see how the door is actually hinged in the attic. Once down, it provides an insulative value of about R16. This keeps attic cold out in winter and perhaps even more importantly shields against the hot attic heat in the summer. The result? In summer, there is almost always at least a 20-degree difference between outside temperature and inside. If it's 90 degrees outside, it's likely 70 or less inside. At long last, I was finally ready to bring in permanent power to the shop. The electric pole where it would be tied in was about 100 feet away, located on the edge of my neighbor's property. For aesthetic reasons, I decided to bring in a buried line. Here you can see my good friend and neighbor Ray digging the 4-foot trench. He was kind enough to do so at no charge and I was very appreciative. Per local code, the wire was encased in Schedule 80 conduit and had a warning tape laid about a foot above it. Any future individual digging down would hopefully see the tape first and not hit the line. Here are a couple views of the conduit coming up out of the trench where it met the shop. Just prior to this, there had been a lot of rain in the area, so it didn't take long for the trench to fill with water. Once backfill was accomplished, this is how the line came into the shop. Even though I had wired the entire shop, I hired a qualified electrician to tie the power into the main breaker box. I could have done it, and if I were on a deserted island, I would have done it, but at the end of the day, I wanted to be certain it was done correct, and he did a great job. And as you can see, there's a cutoff here on the outside wall. As the trench power line was being installed, this was the view inside the shop behind the outside cutoff. The power line was brought in through the wall directly into the back of this large commercial circuit box I found used. As mentioned previously, the line leading up to the ceiling was the line over to the subpanel found on the north wall. The separate conduit on the right from the green small box is for future use, where I plan to run a power from a 3-phase converter to a few of my larger tools down through the ceiling. With the installation and wall covering of the main circuit breaker box, the wiring was basically finished in the shop. At this point, the shop was essentially done. Having said that, I would hasten to add that the shop will never likely be done in my lifetime. I know that sounds like a dichotomy, but my guess is there's always going to be a few changes, modifications, or additions from time to time. It's just the nature of the beast. Once the shop was basically finished, it was time to begin organizing floor space, shelf placement, machinery location, material storage, and essentially fleshing out the shop. I thought some of you might enjoy how that evolves, so I'm going to include a segment about that as well. My first strategy was to turn this entire west wall into a storage area. In the early stages, I had already built this large shelf you see on the right. Now I added these 9 vintage heavy-duty metal shelves once used by the U.S. military. They would become the repository of my extensive nut and bolt collection, a small part of which you see here. Think Fastenal, divide by 2, and then add some vintage nuts and bolts that Fastenal doesn't sell, and that pretty well describes the collection. Here you can see after all 9 shelves were stuffed to the gill with organized nuts and bolts. There was so much weight on the shelves, I had to tie them together with steel brackets for fear they might fall over. Behind the license plates up high is an angle iron bolted to each of the 9 shelving units, tying them all together, and then connected to the ceiling shelving at right. By the way, just for fun, the license plates are all from states I've lived in from birth to the present. The years, beginning with Pennsylvania, where I was born in 1954, are also correct. The other states are Maryland, Alaska, California, Montana, Michigan, Alberta, Canada, Ontario, Canada, and Georgia, where I've now lived for the last 35 years. Those of you who grew up playing with A.C. Gilbert and Meccano erector sets should take note of the Meccano airplane hanging on the wall. This was fairly early when I was organizing vintage signs in preparation to put them up around the shop. These had been collected over many years from scrap metal dealers, garage sales, and elsewhere. This is an early view of the north wall, where I placed some shelving up high to hold some antiques. Similar high shelves are also on the opposite south wall. Several of the shop machines are powered by 3-phase power. Since heavy wire to them is expensive, it only made sense that those tools should be as close as possible to the main circuit box, the source of power. And that's why the large press, the iron worker, the air compressor, the mill, and large sheet metal shear are all close to the southeast corner. What you're looking at here is in the middle of the shop, towards the south wall. You can see the shelving up high that mirrors the north wall shelving we just looked at. In the foreground is a small vintage 3-foot stomp shear, probably over 100 years old. I use it a great deal. To the left is a large finger brake that once belonged to Blueberry Equipment in South Haven, Michigan. Nearly 50 years ago, I worked there while I was in college and used this exact brake. It was at BEI, as it was then known, that I learned many of the skills that allowed me to build this shop. At that time, it was the only place in the world that Blueberry pickers were made, and my job was to make sheet metal parts that went on the pickers. When the company went into bankruptcy several years ago, I attended the auction and bought this brake and several other tools that I had once worked on as a young man. So besides being outstanding vintage tools, they have great sentimental value as well. Against the wall under the vintage Coke sign is a mill, and to the right is a 10-foot Chicago brake. It was on that brake that I formed various pieces of sheet metal during construction of the shop, including all the aluminum pieces that covered the baseboard. If you look closely at the brake counterweight ball, you can see where I padded it with carpet pieces and then covered it with duct tape. Now, if someone accidentally happens to walk into that, they'll hit some padding instead of a 75-pound steel ball. I've learned that steel doesn't give very much. Directly behind the Chicago brake is the sheet metal storage area. The larger pieces, like 4x8 or 4x10, are on 3 racks that are on wheels. The smaller pieces are on the yellow rack, also on wheels. On the rare occasion I need the brake for large pieces of sheet metal, the racks can easily be rolled out of the way and then rolled back afterwards. Next to the sheet metal is the steel storage rack. When working on projects, it's nice to have a choice of materials close at hand. Between the steel rack and the bathroom wall is where the lift cage is kept. Here you can see it in an earlier construction photo. A side benefit of having the cage here is that it can be used to easily climb to the shelf above the bathroom and then thereby gain access into the attic. The space between the steel rack and the cage itself is where the forklift gets stored when not in use. The Kalamazoo saw seen here was later moved to its permanent location by the north wall. The saw rocks. It's a beast, and I love it. This is looking at the bottom of the large shelf by the nuts and bolts. At the very bottom left is a large roll of 20-gauge cold roll, about 40 inches in width, that probably weighs 5,000 pounds. When needed, that can be pulled out with the forklift to have any length cut off for use. To the right are 2 steel sawhorses made of 2-inch by 1/4-inch steel that are also very handy. Above the first shelf, the gray drawer unit is full of various types of pop rivets, vintage square head bolts and nuts, and other miscellaneous. It's very handy storage. As more storage items came into the shop, chaos ensued. Containers with thousands of nuts, bolts, and miscellaneous littered the floor. Fortunately, as those items found shelves, floor space once again magically reappeared. What follows is a brief overview of some of the smaller tools in the shop. On the left is the green Diacra No. 1 notcher, and behind that is a powered slip roll capable of shaping quarter-inch steel flat stock. The cream-colored unit on the table sharpens large drill bits, and beside that is a small vintage 6-inch hand slip roll. This next photo shows the Diacro No. 2 punch with various punches and dies around it. To the right is a hand-driven 36-inch Pexto slip roll. Several years ago I restored the punch, slip roll, and this lift table. Here's a picture of the table as it used to look. And then here's another picture showing how it now looks. To the right of the green table is an arbor press that currently sits on the base of an old commercial drill press. Just right of that, out of frame, is this Wheelwell's metal bandsaw. And here is a better picture of the press. Both the press and bandsaw were part of the BEI auction that I spoke about earlier. These were tools that I used nearly 50 years ago. This spot welder was also one of those auction tools. The copper tongs were being replaced when this photo was taken. At center here is the Diacro No. 2 hand shear for cutting light sheet metal. To the left is a vintage tool that cuts small round stock, and to the right is the Diacro notcher mentioned previously. This is the Diacro bender, which can create very interesting shapes. I also have a larger bender in the shop for heavier steel. The green vintage tool in the foreground is an old Hannafin press made in Chicago over 100 years ago. I plan to convert it into a small English wheel. Just behind that is an extremely heavy steel table with a 1-inch thick top that sits on heavy I-beams. It holds my 361-pound vintage German anvil that bears the marks SH, and next to it is the large vise that dates back to the 1800s. To the right of that you can see the gas cutting torch, which is always handy in a shop. Two other tools kept under this table are these swage blocks. This one is 289 pounds and this one is 133 pounds. Both are vintage 1800s used by blacksmiths and very useful in forming metal into various shapes. Another important piece of equipment is the air compressor. I've not yet installed a motor on this, but have a secondary small portable unit to use in the meantime. On the table here in the foreground is a small Harbor Freight finger brake. Behind is the Mitsubishi forklift, one of the most critical tools in the shop. Without it, I could not move many of the heavy pieces of machinery. This smithy, mill, and lathe does adequate work on small projects. In this photo you can see the 2-inch belt sander and to the left grinder, which are both invaluable. And what shop would be complete without an antique A.C. Gilbert erector shop on display? This is one I built nearly 10 years ago. It has over 1,000 moving parts, and if you Google the words Incredible Gilbert, you can find a YouTube of it running. So, the question is, now that you have a shop, what are you going to do with it? Very briefly, here are 3 of my first projects while using the shop. I needed a rack on wheels to store small pieces of sheet metal, and this was the result. Another project involved restoring this antique shop cart. I found some 100-year-old wood to replace the rotted original, and now it's as solid as when first built, and a useful item in the shop. And finally, I made Susie Q to adorn my front door. She was made out of 20-gauge sheet metal, painted, and then got a 1/2-inch plywood base for support. Here she is with me, Handy Randy, to welcome everyone to the shop. Well, there you have it, how I built my pole barn shop. I hope you enjoyed the story, the journey, and perhaps even gleaned a few ideas for your project. This video series is dedicated to my father. Without the skills he lovingly taught me, this project would have never happened. Remember, if you adopt any idea from my project, make sure you run it by a qualified professional first. I'm not a builder, I'm not a professional, I'm just sharing the story of how I did it. Stay well, stay safe, and always treat others as you would like them to treat you, because after all, what you sow is what you reap. It's good advice. If you like this, hit the like button and tell your friends. Thanks for watching, good luck, and 73 to everyone. Randy out.